Before I begin, I must relate some of the sad story which led to the greatest moment of horror known to my people, the Highland Elves of the Western Mountains. My name is Antisis, and I am a priestess of the Morning Light Church, one of the 6 temples located here in the city of Trueshade. This tale begins with the march of the human general Calvadath against my people at the end of the Age of Light, some 200 years ago. Carried on the winds of a freezing blizzard, they fell upon my kingdom in the dark hours of morning, and swarmed from the lowland forest shod in black armor with the standard of the Black Spider blazoned on their flags and shields. It is unknown how they managed to avoid the all-seeing eyes of the watchmen at the borders, but it is widely speculated it was under the cloak of death magic wielded by the few human sorcerers of the time. We are told that by means of his dark energy, the humans of Calvadath's now fallen empire had learned that by the drinking of elven blood, they could sustain their lives far beyond the limits of their pitiful lifespans. This war would last but a few brief decades, but the after effects of the humans' invasion would impress upon the centuries with its taint. The soldiers of Calvadath's army would rape and pillage every civilized land they encountered, and even at their end, by the hand of the now almost extinct elven witches, they would leave a mark of their evil in the form of bastard half-elven children. By the laws of the Elven Council, these children could not be terminated, but instead were allowed to live as slaves, rendered infertile by a magic ritual. Never in our history had there been so many of these unwanted children among us. However, their strong physical abilities made them well suited for lives of servitude and labor. In the aftermath of the war, these half-elves grew to adulthood among us, but even our own archives record the abuse and low esteem that was heaped upon them. It would only be a matter of time before the rebelliousness of their human blood would stir in their oppressed hearts, and they would become united under the leadership of the strong-willed son of Calvadath himself. Called Kenru Arachnus, child of the Black Spider, he brought the downtrodden bastards of war into a fellowship, and led them west across the mountains to find freedom. The Elf Lords did little to dissuade the fleeing slaves, and took the pilgrimage as a blessing that these half-breed reminders of such a dark time would be gone. Across the western mountains lay a dark and twisted land which had long been home of the Deselvin. These had been the dark-haired and eyed Wraith Elves, of whom the witches were originally descended. Their empire had become a vast ruin enshrouded in moss, vines, and the blackwood trees in the valley of the Twilight Host. Here the refugees made their home amongst the fallen temples and vast fallen stones of a lost world. It was amongst these crumbling towers and heaped lichen-covered houses that they uncovered the hideous statues representing the forgotten demon gods of the Wraith Elves. Having no faith in the powers of nature worshipped by their cruel masters, they fell into the worship of these ancient spirits, and in time awakened them from their slumber. Ru Arachnus became the high priest of these spirits, and is said to have negotiated dark contracts with the depraved entities of the old world. He pleaded with the spirits for some way that his people might once more be blessed with the ability to bear children, so that they might continue as a people. The name of the demon which answered his prayers is not known, but the deal which he struck is. The half-elves would forego the long life granted by their elven blood, and in return, they would be made the most prolific breeders of the known world. Ru and his people accepted these terms without thought of the consequence that would come at the onset of this peculiar blessing. Gathered amongst the ruins of the Deselvin city of Wraithheim, the half-elves fell into a lust like nothing any of them had ever known. In the light of the amethyst moon, they writhed together like beasts for night after endless night, until the bellies of their women swelled with the fulfilled promise of the demon god. In the following months, children were born by the hundreds, but from the very first it was clear that all was lost. There were no single births amongst them, as every woman expelled twins, triplets, and quadruplets. The infants were not the frail white babes of the elven or human bloodlines, but were instead shriveled gray-skinned things which entered the world already sharp of tooth and claw. Their children could not be suckled on the milk of their mother's breast, but instead lapped at the spilled raw blood of hunted prey like beasts. Their eyes were huge and yellow in color, having the peculiar aspect of reflecting light and darkness like the animals of the night. As they grew, their bodies were stunted in height, twisted and malformed, with long, intensely powerful arms, and dark, cunning intellects which turned only to the arts of killing and the hard magic of death. These children shunned the daylight and slept together in droves within the subterranean ruins and caves of the forest. The half-elves watched in horror as their progeny produced offspring unto themselves before they had even crested their 10th year of existence. They named them the Goblynn, which means those who devour. Then, in the light of the next amethyst moon, they fell upon their parents, slaying them as they slept to feed on their warm flesh, thereby paying the demon gods their owed sum. So was born the kingdom of the Goblin in the valley of the Twilight Host. These events transpired unbeknownst to the lords of the Highland Elves, as their people flourished and rebuilt the woodland cities of their empire. Once more the townships grew beneath the trees of the forest, and the elves returned to the traditions of their heritage. It was in the month of the autumnal solstice, as the festival of the dead was underway, that the first glimpse of the horrors beyond the mountains began to trickle down over the cliffs. As the leaves of the oaks and brash thorn trees turned golden and red, the leaves fell dry and rustled to the forest floor. Disappearances began in the small villages of the western borders. Hunters would not return from their wanderings, and farmers would vanish from the fields. Children who gathered nuts and berries would report that shadows had followed them at dusk, until one of their number would be lost in the trees without a cry or scream. Search parties were organized, and the greatest trackers were brought from the far corners of the highlands to give some evidence of what had transgressed. Seers looked deep into their crystal stones, but could see only shadows of blood. It was only by chance that an unlikely salvation was brought to the attention of the Elven High Court by the Fisher Elves of the East Border. It was reported that still dwelling along the edge of the Lake Caltagrim was the elven witch responsible for the loss of the group sent to liberate the eastern forest of its curse a century ago. The party had been lost as the entire island sank beneath the waves, leaving the waters of the area cursed, unfishable, and plagued by monstrosities which defied description. The witch had escaped, and was then thought lost to justice until recently spied inhabiting the woods along the lake. I was chosen by my order to accompany a group of 20 swords to the haunted land to capture and bring the one called Sorcière Luno, the Moon Witch. The closer we came to the edge of the lake, the thicker and more impassable the wilderness became. There were no longer the bright living woodlands of the Elven Kingdom, but were instead the twisted and thorny paths corrupted by the energies of some dark sphere. I could hardly imagine anyone living here in the shadows, let alone one of elven blood. Yet the long-fanged, giant-hunting cats found his scent in moments upon crossing into the woods. They led us down a winding trail to the dark water's edge, and here the sun never shone through the gray, impenetrable clouds, and a thick mist hung preternatural and ever-present over the waters and shore. We marched along the rocky, moss-laden bank until we saw a vast boulder emerge from the dense fog. Perched upon it, huddled in a ragged cloak with a long fishing pole clasped in his thin white hands, was Luno. His features were hidden in a blanket of long, straight black hair that hung over his shoulders like another cloak. However, I could clearly see the skin of his arms was ghost white with a slight bluish tint that gave the impression of a cadaver's cold flesh. Slung over his shoulder was an enormous longbow carved roughly from the black wood, and a quiver of arrows with jagged black feathers for fletching. We approached cautiously as the guards withdrew their swords and aimed their bows. "Sorcière Luno," I called out with a slight tremble in my voice. "You are hereby named a prisoner of the High Council and called to stand trial for the betrayal of the Corman party." I was answered only by a quiet, hollow laughter from the figure. "Throw down your weapons and present your hands," I shouted with whatever authority I could muster. "Corman was a fool, and so are you if you think I'm surrendering to you." I shook, startled by the sudden jerk of Luno's pull as he lifted a long, slithering eel from the water below and wrestled it from the line before stuffing it into a basket at his side. "I thought you could not eat from these waters," I said with fascination as the figure stood, and I saw the array of pouches, charms, and objects lining the belts which crisscrossed his faded blue tunic. At his sides were a short sword and a dagger, amongst the collection of paraphernalia at his waist. "You cannot eat from these waters," the low, clear voice from beneath the tangle of hair explained, "but I can. I do not desire conflict with you, witch, but you must obey or be taken by force," I shouted as he leapt from the rock like a falling shadow and landed a ghost on the ground below. "You cannot force me to come with you, my dear. You have no means. I suggest if you want my help, then you ask respectfully." I should have been indignant with anger, but the tone of Luno's voice was soft, without arrogance. I felt only growing fear that what he was saying was true, and that I had no way by which to capture him by force if he should refuse. "Come with me to my dwelling, and speak to me as one speaks to a prospective employee, and we shall discuss whatever it is that brings you here. But just you, priestess, and these hunters so willing to fight can wait here. If they are patient, then I am sure that something will come along that is more than willing to provide them with a challenge." I studied him as he held out his hand, beckoning me forward. "You cannot go with him alone," the captain said with an icy rage. "Let us take him." I contemplated all I had read of witches in the archives of the temple, and knew that even though Luno may well have been a weak practitioner a century ago, he could possibly have become almost invulnerable, I know. Especially here, where the dark energies were carried on the wind like dust. "So be it," I answered to the captain's heart. I then followed as Luno made his way up a small path into the woods above the shore. His dwelling was a shack, constructed from the planks of fishing boats, driftwood, and cured animal hide, positioned in the forks of a giant tree, which he accessed via a long knotted rope ladder. He hung the basket by a strap over his shoulder as he began to climb, and I followed. Once safely on the platform of the hut, he lifted the ladder into a pile at his side, and entered beneath a dirty, thick red blanket which served as the dwelling's door. Here he poked at a stone fire pit in the center of the room and applied a dried log, which soon was burning readily. He seated himself at a table, and withdrawing the eel, severed its head with one quick swipe, and commenced to cleaning and gutting it, a process which took place in a matter of moments. He placed the eel in a large cauldron and hung it over the fire, before adding a variety of herbs and plants from the many makeshift shelves of jars and vials which surrounded the room. Now, in the light of the fire, I could see the face, which had up until now been hidden. His eyes were enormous, even for those of an elf, but so dark and unsettling that his nature was more than apparent. His face was drawn and hollow, with a long, strong brow, which served to deepen his expression beyond that of most elven men, as he gazed at me from where he now sat, indicating that I should sit on the other side. He reached for a bottle that sat at the center of the table, and grasping 2 wooden goblets from a shelf, poured a bitter-smelling dark red wine. "I know why you are here," he said as he drank the first draught from his cup. "Not very clever to arrest someone, then expect their aid, but the elves have never been particularly sensitive in such matters." He poured another goblet. That's what I guessed from its flavor was a variety he had brewed here himself. "What makes you think that I need your aid?" I asked as my body warmed even from the small drinks I took of the potent brew. "I know all about the disappearances. It's all the fisher folk talk about." He was smiling mischievously as he withdrew a pipe as long and thin as a reed, which had been tucked amongst the other things on his belt. He checked the tiny thumb-sized bowl and tapped it carefully before lighting a stick from the fire and using it to sparkle tobacco with it. "Do you honestly think that no one knew I was out here all this time until now? I've been trading with the fishing villages since the day I crawled half dead from that cursed lake. I can't say I'm surprised they betrayed me, but then again, if the need was desperate enough, any may fall into temptation. So will you come with us?" I said as the floral smelling smoke drifted from the damp fishing net. "No," he replied, without any hint of emotion in his voice. "What was the point of bringing me here, if you had no intention of helping?" "To give you a warning. I am not going with you because there is nothing that I can do. You see, I've spent this past century wandering here and there, collecting tales and rumors from far abroad, hoping that what my suspicions were not justified." "What are you talking about?" The heat of the wine was nursing an ember of rage against the witch as he smiled and downed another entire cup at once. "When I saw what was waiting in that cave, I was touched by a darkness which you cannot even begin to understand. The thing that was sealed down there was not just some intelligence, but a living, undying disease of corrupted energy. I realized later that if that is what is out there, and that is what was running loose in the times of old, when the safe world of the elves can only be an illusion, The more I traveled, I was even more convinced of my theory. And what was your theory, Luno? I said, unable to hide the disgust I felt for him in my voice. That the world had ended long ago, but the elves had failed to realize it. Go further east and see the ruin that is the cities of men. They are treacherous pits of depravity and horror. They wallow in their own filth like swine and violate everything that moves with their lust. They swim in disease and corruption like fish in the waters of the ocean. Go north and see the commonwealth of the dwarves, the sterility and the lifelessness of the dead, inhabiting the lives and daily labors of the supposedly living. Their minds so obsessed with the calculation of fate that they cannot even fathom random impulse. They have translated the universe into numbers, and no longer even believe in the presence of the dark gods, which once enslaved them. They control their breeding by license and can only marry by writ of law, and of course the almighty Highland Elves, which watched as their cousins in the south were destroyed by the Plague Eater without even sending a message of pity. The world grew sick 200 years ago, and it is struggling in the throes of death while the elves live in ignorance. You want to know what is causing the disappearances? I say look over the mountains, you fool. I sat in disbelieving fury as the witch broke into a callous laughter, which pierced my ears and left my every emotion cold and withered in my heart. I stood and left the chamber, flinging down the ladder, and climbing down so unnerved that I almost dropped to the earth below. When I found my men, they looked on in wonder as I approached in tears and ordered them to mount up. But what of the witch? The captain said, flustered and irate. He is of no use to us, I declared, as I rode off into the mist. When we arrived at the border of the west, we were met with a sight I shall never forget. The sky, although clear from a single cloud, was gray with the smoke of fire that burned like the sun. As we rode on, village after village was desecrated and destroyed as ravens, crows, and vultures flew in arms to devour the scraps of bleeding, torn livestock. Yet nowhere were there bodies of the elven people which had lived in these towns. Their homes were empty and their temples destroyed. If we had known any hope, it was destroyed by our approach to the city of our kingdom's capital. The gates were open as we drew near, and within the city was a tomb. Everywhere were the signs of bloodshed and violence, but nowhere were there the corpses to show proof of murders committed. I entered the temple and stood at the altar of light, praying for guidance as the sun vanished behind the city walls, and the third night of the amethyst moon began. The violet glow of the orb filled the night as I heard the scream of my men outside. I ran through the gates to find them locked in combat with an army of horrid creatures, which seemed to come oozing from every crack and hole in the city like insects on the body of carrion. Their eyes gleamed sick yellow as their bizarre barking growls occasionally imitated the language of our people. I could only discern words like kill, taste, and devour repeated over in varying sequence. I watched as the swords were torn down, defending me from the rusted knives and jagged claws of the creatures. It was only as I fell before them that I saw a shape cross in the sky above. I saw that it was the assembled bones of some dead, monstrous bird, with leather sewed over the bones of its wings, soaring in the night, and upon its back was Luna, who pointed to me as he commanded its descent. The creatures froze and cried out as the undead mount landed, and Luno, shouting curses, fired arrows from his twisted bow with deadly accuracy. Pausing, he extended his hand, and I took it weeping as he pulled me onto the furs tied as a saddle over the spine of the bird. We took flight and left the city behind as we flew into the night. What do they want? I asked as I saw the lake of Caltagrim looming in the dim light of morning. To reclaim the long life of their ancestors, lost in trade to a deep mountain. And so, all of the elves, devoured by the Goblynn, for the sake of the years their blood might bestow. As we flew low to the tops of the trees and landed in a clearing, after we had dismounted, Luno waved his hand and spoke a single word in a quiet whisper, which dispersed the energies animating the bones of the giant bird. It fell into a heap of bleached white remains and tall grass in the meadow. I followed him down a path until we came to a cave hidden in the hillside. He turned to me and smiled as he explained. You do not think I would reveal my true home to a group of swords and a priestess come to arrest me. He led me through the narrow opening which led down a long tunnel into a vast open chamber which leaned over a dark underground pool. There were bookshelves and a great circular table covered in stacks of ancient tomes, scrolls, and bottles of corked liquids of various colors. In many places, the stone walls had been carved into enclaves in which sat jars containing the body parts and complete bodies of strange beasts and insects, preserved in a sickly yellow liquid. As he lit the many rows of huge melted white candles which occupied various positions by the tables and chairs, I studied the dark pool and watched as gentle swirls occasionally appeared at the surface. Turning to him with a questioning glance, he said, "There are many things from the lake which find their way into that pool. I study them and document their behavior." "You must be very lonely here," I said as I walked to the fire and sat in a simple wooden chair, trying desperately not to remember the city and the horrors I had witnessed. "I have been alone since I was a child, and from the time my parents were imprisoned by the elf lords, and I escaped, I lived on the fringes of elven society like a thieving animal." "Did you hate them?" I said, with more than a little accusation poisoning my words. "Not enough to wish this fate upon them. That is what you are truly asking. I simply wanted them to leave me be, and not be hunted because of the lineage of my family or the power I possessed." I held my hands over the flames to warm a cold which could not be ignored. It was then I felt cold arms as strong as steel snatch me from where I sat, and a horrible ripping pain in my throat. It was many moments before I realized that Luno had me in an unbreakable embrace, as he bit and drank the blood gushing from my neck with long savage teeth like small ivory knives. After a time, he carefully laid me gasping beside the fire and crouched beside me with the streams of my own life's blood running from the small line of his mouth. I saw that behind him something was rising from the waters into the bank of the cavern floor. I could not discern any recognizable details except that it was long and shining with the black skin of an eel. I told you that when I escaped the lake, I was no longer as I had been before. Contact with the demon altered me in ways that you would find most astonishing and horrible. The blood of the elves is so precious and grants gifts which you cannot conceive of in your pure, frail mind. You are right in thinking that I have been lonely here in this darkness. I will make you an offer, and I warn you, you have very little time to contemplate. Drink my blood and become like me, or perish here and die. Accept my gift, and you will be my servant. It is not so far a step from the life you have chosen thus far in the service of the elven gods. You may well find it most rewarding in time. He withdrew a long, sleek dagger from his belt and sliced a long cut down his wrist before offering it mere inches from my mouth. Together, we will save what elves we can and protect them. "Why?" I whispered as the slow languor of death enshrouded my vision, until all I could see was the blood running in Luno's dark, shining eyes. "We will need them, dear priestess. We will need their blood." And just as the void was imminent, I grabbed at Luno's arm and began to shrink, falling to the temptation of continued existence before the thing which all elves fear most: death.